On April 14, 1865, a pistol cracked in the darkness of Ford's Theater, and President Abraham Lincoln survived. The misfiring of John Wilkes Booth's Derringer left the commander-in-chief bruised but alive, and the nation held its breath as the Union leader staggered to his feet on the stage. In the moments that followed, doctors rushed him to a nearby boarding house where he lingered through the night, his mind already turning toward the fragile peace that lay ahead. The assassination attempt had failed, but the shock reverberated through Washington, reminding every citizen how close the country had come to losing its guiding hand. Lincoln's recovery was swift enough for him to address a trembling crowd on April 15th, delivering a brief but powerful speech that reaffirmed his vision of malice toward none, charity for all. He spoke of reconciliation, not retribution, and promised that the blood shed at Gettysburg would not be wasted on endless vengeance. The president's words set a tone that would shape the nation's next chapter. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. With his life spared, Lincoln returned to the White House, determined to turn wartime victory into lasting peace. By June 1865, he introduced a comprehensive Reconstruction Bill that differed sharply from the punitive measures later imposed by Andrew Johnson. The legislation offered unconditional amnesty to most former Confederates who swore an oath of loyalty, while reserving exceptions for those directly responsible for war crimes. In exchange, every Southern state would be required to ratify a new clause guaranteeing civil rights for freed people, particularly the right to vote and equal protection under the law. The proposal ignited fierce debate in Congress. Radical Republicans pressed for harsher terms, fearing that leniency would allow former slaveholders to reassert dominance. Lincoln, however, invoked his own words from Gettysburg. The new birth of freedom must be protected by a government that could not afford another civil war. He promised federal oversight of voter registration and the establishment of public schools open to all children, regardless of color. The bill passed the House on August 12, 1865, and after intense negotiation in the Senate, it became law on September 15. The passage of this moderate yet firm legislation set a precedent. Reconstruction would be guided by federal authority, but tempered with an appeal for national unity. It opened the door for rapid political reintegration while planting the seeds for future civil rights protections. Lincoln's endorsement gave the 14th Amendment unprecedented momentum. In our timeline, the amendment languished in Congress until after Johnson's impeachment, finally being ratified on July 9, 1868. Here, with a president actively championing equal citizenship, the necessary 3/4 of state legislatures approved it within months. By December 1865, Virginia, Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas had each sent their ratifications, followed swiftly by the remaining former Confederate states. The amendment's swift adoption cemented two critical principles: that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens, and that no state may deny any person equal protection of the laws. Lincoln used his annual State of the Union address on December 20, 1865, to declare the 14th Amendment the keystone of our Union's rebirth. The rapid ratification forced Southern legislatures to confront the legal reality of black citizenship before they could enact any restrictive codes. This acceleration also altered the political calculus for the radical Republicans, who now found a solid constitutional foundation for their civil rights agenda, reducing the need for further constitutional amendments in the near term. Armed with the new amendment and Lincoln's Reconstruction Bill, the federal government set clear conditions for readmission. By March 1866, each former Confederate state had convened constitutional conventions to draft new state constitutions that complied with federal mandates. Integrated public schools were established alongside voter registration drives aimed at enfranchising freedmen. In South Carolina, a coalition of Unionists and Freedmen's Advocacy Council leaders drafted a school law that mandated mixed classrooms in every county. In Louisiana, the governor signed an order requiring all eligible black men to be added to voter rolls within 60 days, backed by federal marshals who ensured compliance. Resistance persisted. Southern redeemers organized rallies decrying Northern tyranny, but the presence of Union troops along key rail lines and ports discouraged violent obstruction. By June 1866, Congress declared all 12 former Confederate states fully restored to the Union. The process was smoother than in our history because the combination of constitutional guarantees, federal oversight, and Lincoln's personal appeal for reconciliation prevented many of the violent backlashes that later erupted under Johnson's lax policies. With the 14th Amendment already entrenched, Congress moved to codify its promises. In February 1869, the Senate introduced a comprehensive civil rights bill modeled on Lincoln's earlier proposals. The legislation, later known as the Civil Rights Act of 1870, prohibited discrimination in voting, employment, and housing. It established federal courts with jurisdiction over violations, and it created a Department of Reconstruction to oversee implementation. President Lincoln signed the act into law on March 1, 1869, delivering an address that highlighted the nation's new covenant with its black citizens. The law empowered the Freedmen's Advocacy Council to file suits against discriminatory practices, while the Northern Labor Coalition rallied behind it, seeing a fairer labor market as essential for economic growth. Implementation was swift. Within a year, over 200,000 African Americans had secured federal jobs. Integrated schools reported rising enrollment, and Southern towns that once barred black voters began holding inclusive elections. The Act's enforcement mechanisms, federal marshals, and the newly formed Reconstruction Department curbed the resurgence of overt white supremacist violence that plagued the post-Johnson era. Reconstruction's political stability opened the door for economic transformation. In late 1869, Lincoln announced a series of federal infrastructure projects aimed at modernizing the devastated Southern economy. The Pacific and Atlantic Railway received subsidies to extend tracks from Atlanta to Birmingham, linking coal fields with industrial centers. Federal grants funded textile mills in Richmond and shipyards in New Orleans, attracting Northern capital eager to tap cheap labor and new markets. The Freedmen's Advocacy Council negotiated contracts that guaranteed fair wages and apprenticeship opportunities for former slaves, curbing the spread of sharecropping. By 1875, cotton production had diversified. While still a staple, Southern farms began planting tobacco, timber, and iron ore under contract with Northern firms. The resulting rise in industrial employment reduced dependence on agrarian labor and fostered a growing black middle class. These policies also softened the bitterness that historically fueled the lost cause narrative. Former Confederate elites, now participating in federally backed enterprises, found economic incentive to cooperate rather than resist. The South's integration into a national market accelerated urbanization, and by 1880 cities like Atlanta and New Orleans boasted mixed-race business districts, a stark contrast to the segregation that later defined them. The political fruits of Lincoln's Reconstruction culminated in the presidential election of November 1880. The Republican ticket featured former Governor James G. Blaine for president, with former Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton as his running mate, both staunch supporters of civil rights legislation and economic modernization. Their platform emphasized continued support for the Civil Rights Act, federal investment in Southern infrastructure, and protective tariffs to safeguard American industry. Democrats nominated a coalition led by former Confederate General John Bell Hood, promising states' rights and an end to what they called Northern interference. Yet their appeal faltered. Many Southern voters, now enfranchised black citizens and economically tied to Republican-backed projects, turned out in record numbers for the GOP. Lincoln's endorsement of the ticket at a rally in Washington on October 12, 1880, his final public appearance before his death later that year, underscored the continuity of his vision. The Republicans won decisively, securing 215 electoral votes to the Democrats' 124. The victory cemented Reconstruction as an enduring national policy rather than a temporary experiment, ensuring that civil rights protections remained at the heart of federal law. Abraham Lincoln's survival altered the trajectory of a nation poised on the brink of division. By guiding Reconstruction with a moderate yet principled hand, he secured early constitutional guarantees for African Americans, fostered economic revitalization in the South, and avoided the violent backlash that later marred the era. The integrated schools of the 1870s produced generations who grew up knowing they could share classrooms regardless of color. The voting rights secured by the 14th Amendment and the 1870 Civil Rights Act kept black political participation robust well into the 20th century. When the United States entered the new century, its cities reflected a more blended social fabric. While prejudice persisted, no society eradicates bias overnight. The institutional foundations laid in those first 15 years after the war prevented the codified segregation that later defined Jim Crow. The nation's narrative shifted from one of Reconstruction failed to Reconstruction succeeded, influencing how future generations understood liberty, equality, and the power of a single decision. In this alternate timeline, Lincoln's narrow escape did more than spare a life. It reshaped a continent's destiny, reminding us that history often turns on the smallest of misfires.